Hey everybody, this is Joe Harper with Reform Truther Ministries. I'm delighted to have Zac Davis back onto the show. Zac, welcome back to the show from Children of the Day. We're going to be covering werewolves and other were creatures today. So, Zac, glad to have you. How are you doing?
Yeah, great to be back, Joe. It's always a good time on here. I love to be a part of what you're doing here with Reform Truth or Ministries. I'm doing good, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. I've been excited to film this all week. I think we have a great topic here. I'm really excited to talk about werewolves today. In particular, because the sightings of these type of creatures has really gone through the roof the past few years. Dogman sightings or wolf creature sightings, or even just cryptid sightings in general. So I think there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be really excited to listen to the conversation tonight. And, I think we're in an interesting time. I wanted to say this to start off because I think we're getting to a point where this stuff has always been such fringe material, but more and more people are encountering this type of stuff on a daily basis. It seems like we're at a time where there's kind of a spiritual uptick with these type of things. So I think this stuff is becoming more relevant for people who may not even have found it relevant so many years back.
Yeah, totally. I agree.
Yeah. So, okay, well, we're going to start today with, can you just start by telling us what do you think is a werewolf? Break that down for us, and what are some of the characteristics of the werewolf?
Yeah, so typically in folklore, a werewolf is an individual with the ability to shapeshift into like a wolf or a sort of bipedal wolf-man hybrid, which is actually where you get the name, werewolf or wer, which means man in Old English, and then wolf. So it's essentially man-wolf. That's what a werewolf is.
Mhm.
The ability to shapeshift is something typically brought on by means of magic, whether that be like inflicted upon one's self in order to gratify, one's own bloodlust, or a curse placed upon that individual by a sorcerer or something like that. There's also the idea that this ability is typically brought on through like the judgment of the gods or God, depending on the lore, and it's usually a punishment for a pretty great offense. And so, one of the most well-known examples of this is the story of Lycaon, the king of Arcadia, who essentially killed and cooked his own son, and then served him to Zeus, basically like as a test to see if he was able to recognize that this was human flesh. And so Zeus, you know, clearly like repulsed by this notion, transforms Lycaon into a wolf. So, transformation is one of the key characteristics of the werewolf. Bloodlust, as I mentioned before, is also key here. Very similar to the vampire in that sense. The werewolf has an intense craving for human flesh and blood that often manifests during transformation. There's also like this element of uncontrollable rage that's often described, particularly in like the Scandinavian accounts. There were these Norse warriors known as the berserkers who would sort of dress up in these skins of animals that they had slain, and it would sort of help them achieve this state of like animalistic primal rage. Most of these accounts don't necessarily include like a full-on metamorphosis, from man to beast, but they clearly suggest like a full beastly possession of body and mind. And that's, often accompanied even with something like superhuman powers and things like that. And so, when we're talking about a werewolf or a were creature for that matter, we're dealing with a person that is entirely possessed by a beastly spirit, accompanied with uncontrollable rage, a lust for human flesh and blood, and, the ability to shapeshift to some degree, into a wild beast.
Right, right. It's interesting. I mean, I know there are other were creatures, and we're going to talk about that later in the video. But it's interesting that it's the wolf is so prominent because wolves are always have this negative connotation in various cultures. We even see that in the Bible. We
Yeah.
see, Jesus, when he's talking about false teachers, he likens them onto grievous wolves, and Paul uses the same imagery, and I don't think that's by accident. I think that the reason why they were pointing to that animal is because everybody knew. I mean, especially in an agricultural context, that the wolf was a menace, dangerous not only to livestock but dangerous to human beings. Now we live in modern times where we, generally speaking, don't deal with wolves coming and attacking our farms, but yeah, it's just interesting that wolf has got such an like what you were talking about. It points to that, to the rage and the bloodlust, because we see those things in wolves. Yeah, so that's really interesting. And you said these things they can be both bipedal and quadrupedal, correct?
Yeah, there's accounts in stories like the beast of Gévaudan, which was sort of understood to be like on all fours, but was still a sort of were creature, that was understood. And then there's other accounts where the transformation is from a man to like an upright bipedal wolf. And so yeah, both of those are pretty common in different mythologies.
Right. And you said that someone who is transforming, they're becoming a werewolf through supernatural means. You said they're possessed with a demonic, beastly spirit. I think you said it, and that kind of points to my next question, because there seems to be, at least in my understanding, there's a connection between werewolves and witchcraft. So I was wondering what you could tell us about that, the connections to black magic, and then what else can you tell us about kind of the origins of werewolves?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think that like this is something your audience might know a bit about, because it does have to do with sort of the Genesis 6 rebellion. If we want to make this connection, we first have to understand like witchcraft and where this idea comes from. And the story of the sons of God, they go into the daughters of men and they bear giants. And it might come as no surprise, that these fallen angels and their offsprings were judged by God for this rebellion. But one thing that doesn't really get talked about very often is the fate of the daughters of men who actually bore these hybrid creatures, right?
Right.
Dr. Judd has a very interesting chapter in his book, The Nephilim Dossier, where he talks about these women, or what he calls the primal witch, and he mentions how sources like First Enoch show how these women were direct students or disciples of these fallen angels, and they were taught the secrets of heaven. So things like charms, enchantments, the cutting of roots, and the use of plants, things that are commonly associated with witchcraft even today. And
Right.
we see these practices in like the totemic magic of the American Indian shaman, who is said to be able to shapeshift into certain animals, right?
Right.
And we see it again with the Norse berserker, who's able to become possessed by this beastly spirit, but only after like ingesting certain plants and hallucinogens is he able to embody this state of primal rage. Even Saint Augustine mentions in City of God that he knew of a woman who was able to turn men into donkeys by her enchantments, right? And
Right.
so, when we see shape shifting occur in folklore, it's by means of witchcraft, which we know is passed down by the Watchers in order to proliferate the destruction of mankind, right?
Yeah.
The only exceptions are really when God or the gods personally place this curse on someone. But in one way or another, the practice of shape shifting does appear to be this sort of forbidden craft that was sort of leaked from the unseen realm by, rebellious angels.
Right. Yeah, and I'm really glad that you kind of pointed back to those connections in the antediluvian world, 'cause I think that's crucial. I mean, I think especially when you read First Enoch, you see that the origins of witchcraft itself goes back to the Watchers descending at Mount Hermon, presumably in the days of Jared, and they shared what we would call the natural sciences with humanity, things like agriculture and metallurgy, but they also shared the occult sciences. Pharmakia, they shared that. And I remember I read interview, you were talking about Dr. Burton's work, and I was reading Interview with the Giant. He said it's possible that the first witches were the wives of these watchers. And when I read that and my eyes got really big, I'm like, wow, I've never thought of that before, but that makes so much sense. And I'm really glad that I think it's important to cover this connection between witchcraft and werewolfism, because we live in a world where many conservative evangelical Christians are not only skeptical of creatures such as werewolves, but they're really skeptical about the existence of magic as a whole. And I don't even think even people who would say they're against Darwinian evolution or they're against a more secular worldview, I think regardless, they don't understand the supernatural. And I'm not saying this to be disparaging, but they would be really skeptical to anything that would really be magical or supernatural.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, like, it kind of sucks to say, but I would even say that that's a fatal flaw that the church struggles with even today. You know, like, the church is by definition supposed to have a supernatural worldview. Um, but then, you know, many of the churches, like, you know, I'm willing to believe in Christ. I'm willing to take like the Trinity. Maybe there's some angels up in heaven. Maybe there's a devil down below with a pitchfork, and you know he's got his demon minions. But you know, don't talk to me about, you know, these preternatural creatures, or don't talk to me about these magi, or you know these strange phenomena that, you know, people talk about on a day-to-day basis. And I feel like what ends up happening is this community of people who do deal with the supernatural become alienated from the people who actually have the answers to these questions. You know,
Right.
that's
Yeah.
that's something I feel like sort of, you know, is part of my calling personally, is to try my best to bridge that gap.
Yeah. Amen. And I feel the exact same way. I know a lot of people will resonate with what you just said, because I think there's a lot of these type of topics are getting more popular and more people are looking into it. But a lot of times the people who are doing the research or have had these experiences, they have been ostracized sometimes by their fellow brethren in the church. And I'm encouraged that this stuff is still growing. Like, the knowledge of this stuff is still growing regardless, but it doesn't change the fact that there are a lot of Christians who have had a tough time even navigating those things socially, whatever, because of the fact that their brethren are looking at them like they're a little, a little nuts, a little crazy.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I post things all the time on my Facebook about these topics. You know, what Judd Burton calls preternatural morphology, and some people, you know, think I'm you know, a little strange or whatever, but I'm fine with that. But you know, there are some people. Like, I went to church last Sunday, and you know, this kid came up to me and he's like, oh, you're always posting like things about, you know, vampires and werewolves, and it's just so interesting. And I'm like, yeah, thanks. You know, I do believe these things are real, and I'm like just trying my best as a Christian to contend with these things and provide like an answer to, you know, and also like provide like courage to those in darkness to be able to confront it boldly. And you
Right.
know, when I told him this, he sort of opened up to me about these things that he's been experiencing, that had to do with like sleep paralysis and like night hags, and you know, these weird entities that have been haunting his sleep. And you know, we prayed about it, and he's like, you know, I've never been able to open up to someone in church about this, which I thought was so crazy, because it's like, where else are you going to open up to someone about this? You know,
Right.
at work, you know, wherever else you go, you know, people feel literally more comfortable to talk about paranormal or preternatural experiences than they do in the church. And you know, it's you can tell I get a bit passionate about this kind of thing, but
I love it. I
yeah.
absolutely love it. I mean, this is why really I've told you this before off camera, but the past year, I don't know why, but I've felt a strong urge to really concentrate exclusively on this type of material, giants, some of the prehistoric anthropology, archaeology, but then cryptids and the preternatural and the paranormal. And that's been somewhat of a hard left turn for me, but I just feel like the Lord has said, Joe, this is the direction I'm sending you in terms of your calling. And I think it's for that exact reason, because I think I think it gives you the ability to minister to people who may have had supernatural experiences, but maybe closed off to some of those more traditional avenues of evangelism or ministry from the church. And I think there's a niche there to be kind of to be ministered unto, I guess, or ministered to. But before we move on to the next question, though, just before I get too off track, I wanted to mention this because I know there are going to be people, and I said this before, who are going to be skeptical of this idea of a man metamorphosizing through a wolf, and they're going to be skeptical of that kind of that magical thing. They'll say that's not in the Bible, or that type of thinking isn't in the Bible. And I just wanted to bring out the idea. I think we see these type of things in Scripture. I'm not going to read it, but one example is in Exodus chapter 7, and you have Moses having a showdown with the priests of Egypt, and the miracle of his staff being transformed into a snake. But the priests of Egypt, and they're not serving the Lord. It's not through a biblical miracle. They do the exact same thing, and it's through black magic. And the implication there is that the magic worked. It's like we read over that so quickly. I've said this to people, like, don't you realize that even though it's sinful and evil, that the magic worked? Like, we live in a world where magic works. And I think even Christians, we don't think that way.
Yeah, that's totally right. The Magi in Exodus, they weren't just playing around or using like some old superstitions. They were tampering with something that was actually manipulating like nature as they understood. And that's really what it seems like is going on there. I wanted to pull something up real quick since you brought that up. There is I think one of the passages that comes to mind when we're talking about like were creatures is Daniel 4, where it's talking about how King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he's not sure what to make of it. So he goes to Daniel, and Daniel kind of interprets this dream for him, and he's like, that'll never happen to me. And then it ends up happening to him, and what it is like he's basically like excommunicated from his people and his tribe, and he's made to be like a beast. It says like his nature goes from like that of a man to that of a beast, and his skin begins to be like covered in, I think, like fur or feathers or something, like indistinguishable from a beast, and his nails are that of like eagle talons, and he basically becomes some sort of beast. And it isn't until he acknowledges Yahweh, and he begins to like praise Yahweh as the one true God, that this curse is reversed. And so that's sort of in the same lines as what I was saying about how God or the gods have this ability to cause this metamorphosis to take place. Some scholars will say that it's not so much like he had become like a beast, but he had become more like a primal man. And so there's argument on both sides about that. And I'll be fair to that. I'm not just going to try to take the most preternatural take that I can find. But the thing I wanted to pull up real quick was something I posted on Facebook a couple days ago. And it's a translation of Isaiah 13, verses 20 to 22. And the translation, I believe, was made by Doug Van Dorn. And basically what he does is he takes the most literal translation of what the Hebrew words are, and he applies that. And it actually becomes very different in how it reads because of how uncomfortably supernatural it is, right? So here's just Isaiah 13. It says Babylon will never be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. There no nomad will pitch their tent. There no shepherd will rest their flock. But phantoms will crouch down there. Their houses will be full of howling. Monsters will live there, and satyrs will dance there. Lycans will howl in fortified towers, and dragons in their pleasant places. Right. And so this is just one passage of many that, if we actually took these words for at face value of what they actually mean, their Hebrew words translated,
Right.
you're going to get something a little bit different from what your normal rendering in the ESV or the NIV is. And that's to anybody who says, well, these things aren't really in the Bible. You're just you're adding to it or something, but they really are in the Bible.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a pretty accurate translation of the Hebrew. Just like when we were talking about vampires and we were talking about Lilith in the Hebrew and the King James, just it says screech owl, which if you just read that, you're not getting much of a supernatural understanding. But when you understand who Lilith was and how that shows up even in the extra biblical literature, you get a totally different take on it. And I think that's the same true with what you read, that translation from Doug Van Dorn. It nails it. It's talking about satyrs and supernatural creatures, and I think that's a much more accurate understanding of the Hebrew than what we get out of our translation. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Okay, but then that kind of brings me. That's a good transition though, because we know that werewolves are not the only were creatures that exist. There's a whole bunch of were creatures. So what can you tell us about were creatures other than werewolves, and what are some examples of that from around the world?
Yeah, a lot of were creatures that are described throughout the world are really centered around like the kind of lore that's pertinent to that community, and really like the type of animals that are found in that area. So for example, there's the were hyena that's found in some African cultures, like in Somalia. It's traditionally believed out there that there's a man called the Corius Maris who could transform himself into a sort of hyena man by rubbing himself with a stick. That's actually what the name Corius Maris means. It's like one who rubs himself with a stick. And there's also like in certain Asian countries, you have like the were fox, like in Japan and China, where it's believed that foxes can live to 800 years, and around like the 500-year mark, they're able to shapeshift into humans. So that one's kind of interesting because you have like a original state of an animal that then is transformed into a human. So it's kind of reversed in that way. There's many more. There's in Hindu mythology. I was just talking to Dr. Judd about this recently. There's this demonic entity known as the Rakshasa, and it's usually depicted as this sort of were-tiger, bipedal were-tiger that has the ability to shapeshift into any animal or monster that it wants. Very similar to the Skinwalker in Navajo tradition. There's all kinds of these stories. In fact, a personal story. I'm a part of Youth with a Mission, and here on this base, we have a lot of stories. A lot of missionaries go to different countries and have wild stories. Well, the other day I was talking to a friend of mine who did some ministry out in Haiti, and he told me that he actually witnessed a person shapeshift into a warthog during a deliverance that he was a part of out in Haiti.
Wow.
And so, yeah, that was insane. I was dumbfounded.
Right.
But this stuff is definitely real, and it doesn't seem to be fond of Jesus or really people who come bearing his name.
Right. Yeah, and it's a good reminder. All this, and it's connected to the demonic and to that black magic that we were talking about before. And that just, it highlights that this stuff really connects to it's spiritual warfare. There's the light side and there's the dark side, and this stuff it's not part of the light side, it's part of the dark side, and that's why it hates Jesus, because Jesus is the light.
That's right.
That's a perfect transition to kind of our next question, is because obviously some people have the terrible misfortune to actually run into these things. And what would you say for people? What should they do if they encounter werewolves or other weird creatures? And what do you know about trying to dispatch these
Yeah.
creatures?
Yeah. I mean, of course, your main line of defense against something like a werewolf is going to be your faith in Christ, right? First John 3:8 says, the reason that Jesus came was to destroy the works of the devil. And so this is something where we just have to rely solely on the authority of Christ to deliver us from these kinds of things. But I have, spent some time studying like apotropaics, and I find that the dispatchment weapon of pure silver is very interesting when it comes to this topic. When we look at cases of silver bullets being used to dispatch a werewolf, of course, prior to that becoming like a common trope in cinema and literature, you have cases again like that of the Beast of Gévaudan from southeastern France in 1764. This guy, Jean Chastel, takes this silver chalice that's used to hold the wine that becomes the blood of Christ during communion, and he has it blessed by a priest and sort of melted down into shotgun shells. And this is actually what's used to take down this giant werewolf creature that's terrorizing the town. What I find interesting is that the silver motif in these kinds of stories is usually always connected to the power of Christ in one way or another. And silver all throughout Scripture is also representative of God's perfect purity because of the elaborate process of like purification that the metal has to go through in order to achieve its like perfectly refined state. So, there's this concept in the ancient Near East. I talk about this in a video I made recently. It's called the rite of contact and transference. And it was generally understood to be this supernatural process of either impartation or expulsion that happens when a person who's been sort of endowed with supernatural power comes into contact with a ritually or spiritually charged object. And I apologize if that's a mouthful, but I'm working on a more concise definition.
We'll have to work on some nicknames for that. So
Yeah,
we'll get our people on that.
Yeah, but this is sort of the logic behind the scene in Judges 16 when the Philistines are trying to find a way to remove Samson's strength. So they tie him with 7 bowstrings, and then they use new ropes that have never been used, and then they weave his braid into like a certain fabric. These ideas are actually coming from a specific worldview that says, if we're able to put Samson in contact with the right object, then his powers will be revoked. And I think this is the sort of the same line of thinking that people like Jean Chastel had when they used ritually charged objects like blessed silver to take down what appeared to be a preternatural evil. Because the silver bullet was likely to be understood as a symbol of like perfect purity. And again, we're using this vehicle of rite of contact and transference to then penetrate the werewolf, which would have been understood as the symbol of the ultimate symbol of impurity, right? And so pure silver, becomes one of these dispatchment weapons in folklore that has the ability to remove a curse because of its close connection to Christ, who is perfect purity embodied. And what we see with many other dispatchment methods for preternatural evil is that they're usually always in some way or another tied to the power of Christ.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. That's kind of almost like Christ's righteousness purifying sin or cleansing sin. I'm sure I could articulate that a million different ways, but that's just really, really, really fascinating. I mean, that's Psalm 12, right? I mean, talking about how the words of the Lord are like pure silver, or like silver, and they're purified 7 times. So yeah, that's man, that's really, really fascinating.
Well, yeah, I mean, we even see this idea of like rite of contact and transference all throughout Scripture. Like when, the burning coal is pressed up against Isaiah's lips, and immediately upon contact of this coal, his sin is like removed from him. Or the woman with the issue of blood who, upon touching the hem of Jesus's garment, she's her upon contact, her issue is removed. And like kind of like what you're saying, the ultimate, rite of contact and transference is upon faith in Christ, which is our contact point. We take on the righteousness of Christ, and that's what's transferred unto us. It's sort of like penal substitution atonement theory or something, but yeah, it's very similar in that way.
Yeah, no, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. So it's interesting how the silver that's something that kind of got into Hollywood. There's actually some grain of truth in that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of these um like dispatchment weapons, or even like characteristics of the beast, like the creature at like that's being described, they usually, like the author or whoever is putting this together has done like an extensive amount of research in folklore and mythology. Like it's not just popping up out of thin air. And like the guy who wrote the Werewolf, um, I'm drawing a blank on his name. Um, anyways, he says like I didn't. He makes the statement that he sort of came up with the idea of silver being the only thing that can dispatch a werewolf. But that's where a lot of people would just sort of be like, oh well, that's where it began, and there's nothing more to see. But you know what people don't realize is that like just because he made it the only thing, because in his film it's literally the only thing that could take, reverse the curse of the werewolf, doesn't mean that it wasn't a thing that was common in folklore and in mythology, right? And like this,
Right.
this account of the beast of Gévaudan, that's back in the 1700s. And there's an account from the 1800s of these kids who melt down these silver buttons to create bullets to take down a were creature, and so many stories like this. And so yeah, we just have to dig a little deeper than what's seen in film, but most of the time they are drawing on something that's relevant to the study.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So what you're saying is it's not the only thing, but it's certainly silver is certainly a method of dispatchment.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. I don't have this question in my notes, but do you think that the werewolf is connected to a lot of these dogman sightings today? Do you think there's something to that?
Yeah, I think they're very similar. The way I would sort of understand the difference though is like the dogman is sort of a standalone like chimera creature or something that like a Bigfoot, it's not a man sometimes and then a Bigfoot other times, or maybe it is. I'm not watching Bigfoot 24/7, but
Well,
it's
not many of us are sitting down and having coffee with Bigfoot because I'd
right.
have I'd have some questions for Bigfoot. Hey, what's up with you, man?
And if we were, no one would believe us, right?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's absolutely right.
But in form, in characteristics, and trait, the dogman and the werewolf are extremely similar. Um,
Right.
I would say if there was a sighting, it would probably be indistinguishable. But
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they're identical or not, but they do, at least from my limited knowledge, it seems like they are very similar. There may be some overlap, but like we said, there's a lot of variations to preternatural creatures, so who knows? But it's really, yeah, that is interesting. And then one other question I had that's kind of off the shooting from the hip is how prevalent do you think werewolves are? Do you think there's a lot of them around the world, or any thoughts on that? Is that too vague?
yeah, I mean, specifically the werewolf, I don't hear a lot. I don't hear a lot of stories of the werewolf in modern times. other than like certain stories like there's the book like He Came to Set the Captive Free, where it talks about like at some of these satanic rituals and gatherings there is like metamorphosis that takes place, and usually it's in the form of a werewolf. And so I have heard stories like that, usually deeply connected with like the occult. But like some of the things that I see that like are modern, like you could research like, oh, there was this sighting. It's usually something in Africa or in other parts of the world, and it's usually not the wolf. I think that the wolf tends to be glamorized specifically here in North America because of kind of like what you said. It's a very provocative and sinister, uh, uh, you know, creature, and so we've sort of glamorized it. Especially Hollywood has glamorized it, and so that's kind of like at the top of our chart. But I think from what I've seen, it isn't a very uh, common sort of sighting as these other ones are.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Like I said, it just seems like not just werewolves, but just cryptids and preternatural creatures in general. It seems like there's a massive uptick with all this stuff, and I think more people are encountering it. And I think the bad news for that is going to be a lot of this stuff is evil and connected to the occult. So, but the good news, or the way that the Lord may be working it for good, is it may be opening people's eyes to see kind of that more see the world through that more supernatural lens. And I think if that is interpreted through a biblical worldview, that's actually can be a good thing.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah, perfect. So, what are so if somebody was interested in werewolves, what are some where would you point them in terms of resources? What are some good books or resources on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely point people to the work of Sabine Baring Gold. He, he wrote on this subject back in like the mid 1800s, and it's still, to this day, the leading academic work on the subject. It's called the Book of Werewolves. He was also like a priest and a hymn writer, so I always try to encourage people to research this stuff from the Christian perspective, because there's a lot of works that are out there that are going to try to make it seem like this phenomena isn't evil, or like that it's really not out there. And I just find the Christian perspective to be the most reasonable when it comes to this topic. So Saving Baring Gold, the Book of Werewolves. Another good resource is going to be Montague Summers, obviously. He's got it's called The Werewolf in Lore and Legend. And so, Summers is just all around a fantastic scholar. He's got an incredible eye to detail when it comes to this kind of stuff. He's just that guy.
Right.
A little hard to read sometimes because sometimes he'll just throw a whole story in Latin or something and expect you to be following along, because, everyone's got to be as smart as Summers when you're reading his work.
Yeah, for sure. I've read a little bit of his stuff on vampires and werewolves, and that's exactly what I thought. I'm like, man, you got to read this guy pretty meticulously.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is. Like scholars, they write in English, and then like they'll throw Latin at you, and you're like, well, gee, thanks. I guess I should go back and learn my Latin. But yeah,
Yeah,
I definitely had that same
dude.
impression reading him.
He's such an interesting guy. I was like listening to this guy telling stories about Montague Summers. I guess he's like a historian who like did some research on the life of Summers, and basically, he would handwrite his books. Like, even though there was like the typewriter available, he would handwrite because he wanted to. And so he would go to like one book publishing place and be like, hey, I have this really great idea. I want to write this book, but I need a little bit of money to get started. And they'd be like, okay, cool. So they give him some money. And then he'll go to the second book publication place. He's like, hey, I have this other idea. And he would kind of do this for like 3 or 4 different places, and then just kind of live off of that money. And then they would be like, dude, what are you doing? Where's the book? And he's like, I'm working on it. It's going to take time, and, I'm working on it. But eventually they would, 4 or 5 years later, they would get a huge stack of just papers, just handwritten papers that the publishing companies had to sift through and try to make sense of it, because it's a lot easier to just type things, but for whatever reason he had to handwrite it all.
This dude sounds like the quintessential eccentric genius. Like,
Yes.
just really highly intelligent, but someone who might be a little quirky to hang out with or be around.
Yes, he seems like a fascinating guy. I wish I was around during that time. I'd have coffee with him.
Yeah, just for the listeners, early 20th century, I think, is when he was writing his stuff. But yeah, that'd be interesting. Well, I like hanging out with the eccentric geniuses. I like or just eccentric people, because I don't know how many geniuses I know, but I like people who are willing to tread some water, the path less traveled a little bit, because this stuff, it's important, but it is interesting, and hopefully you look at it in a way that glorifies Christ. But
yeah, well,
yeah,
me too, man. That's why I want to start Children of the Day. I don't just want to make these hunting kits, although that is fun to do. I like what I really want to do is just build a community of people that are interested in the supernatural, and sort of develop a strong sense of we're a family together, and we can make sense of these things, and we can also encourage each other to overcome darkness. And that's kind of my value when it comes to Children of the Day. So bring on the what did you say? The eccentric geniuses.
for sure. But what?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say one more resource, and that's Frank Hamill's Human Animal. Great resource for this topic. It's kind of similar to Montague Summers' work on the werewolf, but Frank Hamill, who's actually a female, she does a fantastic job at just unpacking chimeric creatures and were creatures in general. Most of the stuff I talked about today came from that work.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, man, I love your passion. I love your vision for Children of the Day, and it's kind of similar with kind of, maybe not identical, but definitely similar to where I feel like God's wanting me to go with RTM. So yeah, let's talk about that a bit off camera too before we get going. But yeah, I just love what you're doing, and I just love kind of how the Lord's using you to bring awareness to these type of topics.
Yeah, likewise, bro. I appreciate you. I'm glad we were able to connect through the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. Yeah,
it's been great, and I will unashamedly plug Dr. Burton's Institute is great. I'm on class 3 of 12, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. So for the viewers, if you really want to get into some cool stuff, go check out the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. It's great. Before we go, anything you want to? I know you kind of mentioned your business already, Children of the Day. Do you want to anything else you want to plug before we take off?
No, not really. I mean, Children of the Day, I'm on Instagram. That's about it right now. That's all I got going.
No, that's perfect. So if and for the viewers, Zach's monster hunting kits, they're pretty cool. I bought mine, so I can plug that unashamedly too. But yeah, good stuff. All right. So yeah, good stuff, bro. I'm glad to have you on. So everybody, this has been another edition of Reformed Truther Ministries, our conversations on werewolves. Wherever you're at, guys, it is Halloween season, so stay prayed up, stay safe. And everybody, wherever you're at, just God bless everybody. So this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries, signing off.
If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.